Elias felt the coming rain in his bones, an old ache that settled deep in his left knee where a stubborn mule had kicked him 30 years prior. The sky was the colour of a fresh bruise, a dark and bruised purple bleeding into grey at the horizon. He moved with the familiar, unhurried pace of a man who measured his life in seasons, not days. The chickens were already roosting, clucking nervously in the gloom. He latched the door to their coop, the worn wood smooth under his calloused palm. His world was one of textures, the splintery handle of the pitchfork, the greasy wool of his sheep, the cold iron of the water pump. His farm was a small, stubborn pocket of order carved into the edge of the wilderlands. To the east lay the tamed fields and roads of the kingdom. To the west, nothing but jagged hills, ancient forests, and the kind of stories that kept children close to the hearth. He had chosen this place, this solitude, after Martha died. The silence had been unbearable in their old cottage, every empty space echoing with her absence. Here, the silence was different. It was the honest quiet of wind and earth, a silence that didn't accuse him of anything. He checked on the sheep next, their low bleats a comfort in the growing dark. He counted them by habit, his lips moving without sound. All 7 were present, huddled together against the stone wall of their pen. The air grew colder, heavy with the smell of wet earth and ozone. The first drop of rain, fat and cold, struck his forehead as he turned back toward his small stone house. It was a simple life, a small one, but it was his. He asked nothing of the world, and the world, for the most part, had the decency to leave him alone. That was before he saw the movement at the edge of his property, near the old oak that had been struck by lightning the summer Martha passed. It wasn't an animal. Animals moved with the land. This was something different, a frantic, stumbling motion against it. He froze, his hand resting on the iron gate of his yard. His first thought was bandits, but bandits were rarely so clumsy. They were predators, sleek and quiet. This was the movement of the hunted. He squinted, the dim light making shapes trick and bleed into one another. There were several figures, large and broad-shouldered. Then the rain came in earnest, not a drizzle but a sudden, violent downpour that turned the world into a grey sheet of noise and water. The figures collapsed near the split-rail fence that marked the boundary of his pasture. One of them, taller than the rest, fell last, landing with a heavy finality that spoke of utter exhaustion. Elias was not a brave man. He was a practical man, and practicality dictated that he go inside, bar the door, and pretend he had seen nothing. Whatever trouble was bleeding out in the mud at the edge of his land was not his. He had enough ghosts. He didn't need fresh ones. He took a step toward his cottage, the rain plastering his thin grey hair to his scalp. But he stopped. He thought of Martha, finding that fledgling crow with the broken wing. He had told her to leave it, that it was nature's way. She had looked at him with such disappointment. "It's our way to be kind," she had said, scooping it up in her apron. Cursing himself, cursing Martha's gentle memory, he turned back. He grabbed the heavy storm lantern from the hook by his door, fumbled with flint and steel until a weak, sputtering flame bloomed within the glass, and walked out into the deluge. The light cast a pathetic, dancing circle on the churning mud. As he drew closer, the shapes resolved themselves. Orcs, 4 of them. Their green-grey skin was slick with rain and, he saw with a lurch in his gut, with blood. 3 were huddled together, forming a protective wall around the 4th, who lay unmoving on the ground. They were all female, their powerful frames clad in battered leather and piecemeal iron plates. Tusks, smaller than those of the males he'd seen in cautionary woodcuts, jutted from their lower lips. When his lantern light fell upon them, the 3 conscious orcs scrambled into a defensive crouch. One hissed, baring her teeth, a short, brutal-looking axe appearing in her hand as if from nowhere. They were exhausted, wounded, but they were still deadly. A cornered wolf is the most dangerous kind. Elias held the lantern high, keeping his other hand open and away from his body. He wasn't a threat, and he needed them to know it. "I mean no harm," he said, his voice nearly swallowed by the roar of the rain. The one with the axe took a half-step forward, her eyes black as river stones fixed on him. "Go, human," she growled, the word a guttural rumble. "This is not your fight." "You're on my land," he stated, not as a challenge, but as a simple fact. "And she's dying on it." He nodded toward the still figure on the ground. Even in the dim light, he could see the dark stains spreading from a wound high on her side, a terrifying black against the green of her skin and the brown of her leather tunic. A tremor of indecision passed through the group. They exchanged a look, a silent, lightning-fast communication he couldn't decipher. The one who had fallen was clearly their leader. Her armor was of a finer make, chased with patterns he couldn't make out in the gloom. Her stillness was the center of their desperate little world. He made a choice then, the kind of foolish, uncharacteristic choice a man makes when he's been alone for too long. "The barn," he said, pitching his voice to be heard over the storm. "It's dry. You can't stay out here." Suspicion warred with desperation on their faces. He saw it clearly. They didn't trust him. Why should they? Humans and orcs shared a history written in blood and fear. But the rain was turning the ground to black sludge, and the figure on the ground hadn't moved. "Go," the axe wielder repeated, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Elias stood his ground. He was a farmer. Stubbornness was his trade. "She'll be dead by morning if you leave her in this." He looked at the leader. "Is that what she would want? For you to let pride kill her?" That struck home. The 3 of them looked at their fallen leader, then back at him. He saw the calculation in their eyes. A dry barn was a trap, but the storm was a certainty. Finally, the one who seemed the most senior of the 3 gave a short, sharp nod. It was the barest of concessions. Getting her to the barn was a nightmare. The leader was tall and dense with muscle, a dead weight. Elias was strong for his age, but his was a farmer's strength, built for endurance, not explosive effort. The 2 healthier orcs took their leader's shoulders, while Elias and the 3rd, who was favoring her leg, took her feet. They slipped and slid in the mud, their breathing ragged, the rain a relentless hammer. The barn smelled of hay, manure, and old winters. It was a familiar, comforting scent to Elias, To the orcs it was alien. They laid their leader on a pile of clean straw in an empty stall, their movements gentle, reverent. Elias hung his lantern on a nail, its golden light pushing back the shadows. Now he could see her properly. She was magnificent and terrible. Even unconscious, she had an aura of command. A deep, ugly gash ran from just under her arm down her ribs. It wasn't a clean cut. The edges were jagged and discolored, an angry purple-black that spoke of poison or a cursed blade. Her breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the quiet of the barn. He turned to the others. "I have some skill with wounds. Let me look." The axe-wielder, whose name he would later learn was Karga, immediately stepped in his way. Her body was a solid wall of muscle and mistrust. "You will not touch her." "That poison will kill her," Elias said calmly, meeting her glare. "It's already in her blood. Look at her skin." He pointed. Faint black veins were beginning to spiderweb away from the wound. "I have herbs, yarrow to clean it, willow bark for the fever. It's her only chance." He expected another argument, another threat. Instead, a new voice cut through the tension, weak but sharp as broken glass. "Let him." They all turned. The leader's eyes were open. They were a startling shade of amber, like hardened sap, and they were fixed on him. She had pushed herself up onto one elbow, a feat of will that cost her dearly. A sheen of sweat covered her brow. Karga rushed to her side. "Grisha, you should not—" "Be silent, Karga," the leader, Grisha, rasped. Her gaze didn't leave Elias. It was an unnerving, analytical stare. She was weighing him, measuring his soul. "You help," she said to him. It wasn't a request, it was a command. "And if you try anything, my warriors will pull your house down stone by stone." Elias just nodded. "Fair enough." He went to the house, the rain still lashing down, and returned with a wooden bucket of clean water, linen cloths he'd torn from an old shirt, and a small leather pouch of dried herbs. The other two orcs, Urza and Bolg, watched his every move, their hands never far from their weapons. Karga stood over Grisha like a hawk. He knelt in the straw. The smell of blood and sickness was strong. "This will hurt," he said, to no one in particular. He soaked a cloth in the warm water he'd brought and began to clean the wound. Grisha didn't flinch, but her knuckles went white where she gripped a fistful of straw. Her jaw was a line of iron. Elias worked methodically, his hands sure and steady. He had done this for lambs, for a cow with a torn flank, for Martha when she'd sliced her hand open in the kitchen. A wound was a wound. You cleaned it of what was killing it, and you gave the body a chance to do its work. He crushed the yarrow leaves and packed them into the gash. The herb stung, he knew, but it was the best thing for drawing out filth. Grisha let out a sharp hiss through her teeth, a sound like steam escaping a kettle, but she didn't cry out. He then wrapped the wound tightly with the clean linen, the white a stark contrast to her grey-green skin. "I'll make a tea from the willow bark," he said, getting to his feet. "For the fever, you need to drink it." Grisha's amber eyes followed him. "Why?" she asked, her voice a little stronger now. Elias paused at the stall door. "Why what? Why help us? We are a plague on your land. We bring enemies to your door." He looked at the four of them, huddled and defiant in his barn. He thought of his empty house, of the long, quiet years. He didn't have a grand answer. He just had a simple, tired one. "Because you were here," he said, "and you were hurt. It's reason enough." He left them then and went to his own hearth to boil the water. He didn't know it, but that simple act of care, offered without a price, was a more foreign and disarming weapon than any they had ever faced. The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm. Elias would rise before dawn, as he always had, and find one of the orcs already awake, standing guard at the barn door. They slept in shifts, ever watchful. He would bring them a pot of hot willow bark tea and a bowl of thin oat porridge, leaving it on a crate near the stall before retreating to do his morning chores. They took the food, but he never saw them eat. They were like wild things, unwilling to show a moment of vulnerability. Grisha remained in the straw, fighting the fever. Elias would enter the barn twice a day to change her dressing. Karga was always there, a silent, menacing shadow. She would watch him unwrap the wound, her hand resting on the pommel of her axe. She'd inspect his work, sniffing the herbs, her expression unreadable. Elias ignored her. He focused on the task. The black discoloration was receding, slowly. The angry swelling was going down. He would clean the wound, reapply the poultice, and bind it again in fresh linen. He and Grisha rarely spoke during these sessions. The air was thick with a tension that was more than just mistrust. It was an awareness. He was intensely aware of her strength, the coiled power in her muscles, even as she lay weakened. And she, he sensed, was aware of his gentle, impersonal competence. It was a strange intimacy, built in silence and the scent of medicinal herbs. On the fourth day, the fever broke. He entered the barn in the morning to find Grisha sitting up, her back against the stall wall. Her eyes were clear, the amber sharp and intelligent. Karga still stood guard, but the rigid line of her shoulders had softened almost imperceptibly. "The fever is gone," Grisha stated. "Yes," Elias agreed. "You'll be weak for a while, but you'll live." She studied him for a long moment. "You are a skilled healer." "I'm a farmer," he corrected. "Animals get hurt. You learn things." A faint ghost of a smile touched her lips, not quite reaching her eyes. "You think me an animal?" "I think you were wounded," he said, refusing to be drawn. "And now you are not. The rest is your own business." He left their food and went out to mend a fence broken by the storm. An hour later, as he was wrestling a heavy new post into the ground, a shadow fell over him. It was Urza, the largest of the three warriors. She was built like a stone shed, and she looked down at him from a great height. "The post," she grunted, pointing. Elias straightened up, his back twinging in protest. "What about it?" Without another word, Urza reached down, gripped the thick wooden post, and drove it a foot deeper into the damp earth with a single, powerful shove. The ground shuddered. She then took the heavy mallet from his hand. It looked like a child's toy in her massive fist, and sank the post to the correct depth with two contemptuous taps. She handed the mallet back to him and looked at the pile of wood he had yet to use. Then she looked at her companions, Karga and Bolg, who were now standing by the barn. She gave them a sharp, barked order in her own tongue. For the rest of the day, the orcs worked. They did not ask. They simply saw what needed doing and did it. They moved with a brutal, astonishing efficiency. A pile of firewood that would have taken Elias a full day to split was reduced to kindling in under an hour, the sound of their axes ringing like hammers on an anvil. They cleared the large, fallen branch from the pasture, the three of them lifting a weight that would have required a team of oxen. They did not know the finesse of farm work. They packed the earth too tightly around the new fence posts, and they stacked the firewood in a way that wouldn't allow it to dry properly. But they worked. It was their currency, their way of paying the debt they felt they owed. Elias watched them, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. His farm, his place of solitude, was now filled with the sounds of their labor. It was no longer quiet, but it was no longer empty either. That evening he cooked a proper meal, not just porridge, but a thick stew of rabbit and winter vegetables. He took the steaming pot to the barn. For the first time, he didn't leave it on the crate. He walked right into the stall. "You need to eat real food to get your strength back," he said, looking at Grisha. She watched him ladle the stew into the 4 wooden bowls he'd brought. He handed one to each of them. Karga took hers with a suspicious sniff. Bolg, the youngest, took it eagerly. Urza just grunted. Elias handed the last bowl to Grisha. Their fingers brushed. Her skin was cool and rough, like worn stone. They ate in silence, the only sound the scraping of spoons against wood. It was another threshold crossed, sharing a meal, a simple domestic act that felt momentous. A few days later, a fragile peace had settled over the farm. Grisha was now walking, slowly, her hand often pressed to her bandaged side. She paced the length of the barn like a caged cat, her energy returning with no outlet. Her warriors followed her with their eyes, waiting for a command that did not come. One afternoon, Elias was in his workshop, sharpening the blade of his scythe. It was a meditative task, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a familiar comfort. He looked up and saw Grisha standing in the doorway, blocking the light. She was watching his hands. "Your blades are well kept," she said. "A dull blade is dangerous," he replied, not looking up. "Makes you work twice as hard, more likely to hurt yourself." She came further into the small, cluttered space. She picked up a spare handle for a shovel, turning it over in her hands. The smooth, worn ashwood seemed impossibly fragile in her grip. "We value a keen edge." "So do I," he said. She fell silent, but she didn't leave. She watched him work for a long time. He could feel her gaze on him, feel her mind working. He wondered what she saw. An old man, a farmer, something to be used and discarded, or something else. The next morning was cold, with a frost that silvered every blade of grass. Elias was heading out to the woodpile when he saw her. Grisha was already there, beside the pile of wood her warriors had split. She was attempting to stack it. Her movements were stiff and awkward. She was favoring her wounded side, and her hands, unused to rough labor, were already red and raw. He watched her for a moment, unseen. She fumbled a log, dropping it on her foot. A quiet, frustrated curse escaped her lips. Then he saw what she was doing with her other hand. She was taking handfuls of dry straw and trying to wrap them around her palms and fingers. a pathetic attempt at padding. It was a gesture of such fierce, clumsy pride that it struck him harder than any threat. Here was a warrior, a leader, brought so low that she was trying to make gloves out of straw just to feel useful. He turned without a word and went back into his house. He went to the chest at the foot of his bed and opened it. The smell of cedar and old wool rose to meet him. He pushed aside Martha's preserved wedding dress and the small carved bird she had loved. Underneath was a pair of his old work gloves. They were deer hide, stained dark with sweat and oil, the palms worn smooth, the stitching frayed in places. They were shaped to his hands, holding the memory of 1,000 tasks. He took them and went back outside. Grisha was still struggling with the wood, her face a mask of concentration. He walked up to her and held them out, just held them. She stopped, her hands full of straw and splinters. She looked at the gloves, then up at his face. Her amber eyes were wide, and for the first time he saw something in them other than command or suspicion. He saw vulnerability, a flicker of profound, startled confusion. He said nothing. He just offered them. A bridge between his world of calloused work and her world of scarred pride. Slowly, as if they might bite, she reached out. She dropped the straw. Her fingers, long and green-grey, brushed against his as she took the gloves. They were too big for her, but she pulled them on. She flexed her fingers, feeling the worn, supple leather. She looked from the gloves on her hands to his face. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Then she gave him a single, sharp nod. It was more than a thank you. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. She turned back to the woodpile and, with the gloves on, she began to stack the wood. Properly this time, copying the way she had seen him do it, with gaps for the air to pass through. Elias watched her for a moment longer, then turned and went about his day. The air felt different. Something had thawed. It was a fragile thing, easily broken, but it was there. A quiet understanding that had grown in the space between a wound and a pair of old leather gloves. That evening they sat by the fire in his small cottage. It was the first time she had come inside. Her warriors remained outside, posted like stone sentinels in the darkness, but Grisha had accepted his unspoken invitation. She sat in Martha's old rocking chair, the frame groaning under her weight. She still wore his gloves, resting her hands on her knees. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearth. For a long time neither of them spoke. The silence was different now, not tense but companionable. "My mate was a metalsmith," she said, her voice quiet, reflective. "His hands were like yours, calloused, strong." Elias looked at his own hands, resting on his thighs. They were tools, mapped with the story of his life. "My wife, Martha," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so long. "She loved this chair, said the creak was like it was talking to her." "Was she a warrior?" Grisha asked. Elias almost laughed. The image of Martha with her soft hands and gentle smile, holding a sword, was absurd. "No," he said softly. "She was kind. That was her strength. It was more than enough." Grisha considered this, her gaze on the flames. "In my clan, kindness is a weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited." Here too, Elias said, his voice grim. For most people. But not for you. It was a statement, not a question. He didn't have an answer for that. He just shrugged and stared into the fire, lost in memory. She died in winter, he said after a while. A fever. I was a farmer. I knew herbs, poultices, but it wasn't a wound I could clean. It was inside. I couldn't reach it. The old guilt was a familiar weight. I bought this land after. I didn't want to be around people anymore. Grisha listened, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. You blame yourself. Sometimes. Grief is a poison of its own, she said, her voice low. My clan is broken. The one who was supposed to be my shield brother, he broke it. He wanted power. He took it. He killed those loyal to me, those who stood with me. Her hand clenched into a fist, the leather of the glove groaning in protest. My mate was the first to fall. She didn't offer more details, and he didn't ask, but he understood. Betrayal, loss, a world torn apart. They were from different worlds, a human farmer and an orc warrior, but they were speaking the same language. The language of ghosts. They sat there for hours, sharing the warmth of the fire, occasionally adding a small piece of their story to the quiet. It was not a confession, it was an offering, a small, tentative gesture of trust in the darkness. When she finally rose to leave, she paused at the door. Elias, she said, speaking his name for the first time. Grisha, he replied, acknowledging hers. That was all, but it was everything. The peace lasted for 3 more days. It was a borrowed time, and they both knew it. Elias found himself watching the western ridge more and more. He wasn't just afraid for himself anymore. He was afraid for them. The sign, when it came, was subtle. He was checking the fence line at the northern edge of his property, the part that bordered the thick woods. He saw it carved into the top rail of the fence, a crude symbol, a tusk crossed by a jagged lightning bolt. It hadn't been there yesterday. His blood ran cold. It was a marker, a scout's sign. They had been found. He walked back to the farm, his steps heavy. He didn't run. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Grisha was in the yard, watching Bolg and Urza spar with blunted practice swords. They moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. Karga stood nearby, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Elias walked straight to Grisha. He didn't need to say a word. She saw it on his face. Where? She asked, her voice low and tight. North fence, he said. A carving, tusk and a bolt. Karga swore, a harsh, guttural sound. Grak's clan, his trackers. They're scouting, Grisha said, her eyes scanning the tree line. Testing. They don't know our numbers, or if I am even still alive. She looked at Elias. They'll send a small party first, to probe. This is my home, Elias said, the words feeling inadequate. He looked at his small stone house, the sturdy barn, the fields he had worked for 2 decades. I won't just run. It was a foolish thing to say, the pride of a man with nothing left to lose. Grisha's gaze was intense. You are not a warrior, Elias. No, he agreed. I'm a farmer, and a farmer knows his land. An idea, desperate and half-formed, began to take shape in his mind. He looked toward the steep, scree-covered slope at the back of his property. It was unstable, a place he always avoided. They will come from the woods, he said, thinking aloud. It's the best cover. They'll break cover by the creek. Grisha followed his gaze. You have a plan? Maybe. A diversion. They didn't have to wait long. Just after midday they came, 5 of them, male orcs, larger and more brutish than the females. They moved out of the woods with an arrogant swagger, their heavy axes and spiked clubs held ready. They were confident, expecting to find a single wounded female and her battered retainers. Grisha and her warriors were waiting, concealed behind the stone wall of the sheep pen. Elias was nowhere to be seen. He was already moving, scrambling up the back of the slope that overlooked the creek bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He carried a heavy iron pry bar he used for moving rocks. The 5 trackers advanced, spreading out as they approached the farm. Their leader, a big brute with a scarred face and a notched axe, barked an order. They were loud, careless. They saw the farm as an easy prize. As they crossed the shallow creek, Grisha gave a sharp whistle, the signal. Elias gritted his teeth, leaned his shoulder into the pry bar, and threw all his weight against the large, precariously balanced boulder he had identified earlier. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan, the rock shifted. It tipped, dislodging a cascade of smaller stones, and the whole section of the scree slope gave way. It wasn't a huge landslide, not enough to bury them, but it was loud and terrifying. A river of rock and dirt thundered down the slope, crashing into the trees just behind the advancing orcs. They roared in surprise and confusion, spinning around to face the new, unexpected threat. It was the only opening Grisha needed. She and her 3 warriors burst from behind the stone wall. They were not a raiding party. They were an execution squad. Karga, axe in hand, hit their flank like a thunderbolt, her weapon cleaving through the first orc's neck before he even fully turned around. Urza, wielding a massive club she had fashioned from a fence post, met the leader's charge head-on. The sound of their weapons meeting was like a tree splitting in a storm. Bolg, quick and agile, darted in, her short swords a blur of motion, hamstringing another of the trackers. Grisha moved last. She flowed past the chaos, her eyes locked on the 2 remaining orcs who were trying to rally. She was still injured, not at her full strength, but she was still faster than them. Her blade, a long curved sword that seemed to sing in the air, flashed once, twice. It was over in less than a minute, a whirlwind of disciplined, lethal violence. Elias scrambled back down the slope, his legs shaking. He stared at the scene. 5 bodies lay broken in the mud and the shallow water of the creek. Grisha stood over the last one to fall, her chest heaving. Her warriors were already methodically checking the dead, collecting weapons. She looked up and saw him. Her face was a mask of battle fury, but her eyes, when they met his, were clear. She nodded toward the landslide. Your diversion worked. I just made some noise, he said, his voice hoarse. You gave us the advantage, Karga grunted, wiping her bloody axe on the grass. It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever received from her. But their victory was short-lived. Bolg, who had been searching the body of the leader, let out a cry. She held up a horn intricately carved from bone. "A signal horn," Grisha said, her voice grim. He would have sounded it if they didn't report back by sunset. She looked at the western sky. The sun was already beginning its descent. "They know we're here now, and they know we can fight." "How many?" Elias asked. Grisha stared at the ridgeline, a hard, cold certainty in her eyes. "All of them. Grak will bring his whole warband." She turned to him, her expression bleak. "They will be here by dawn, and they will burn this place to the ground." The finality in her voice chilled him to the bone. He looked at his house, his barn, his world. It was all about to be washed away in a tide of violence he had no part in creating. Just before the main assault, as the sky began to pale from black to a bruised purple, a lone rider approached. Not from the west, where the enemy was gathering, but from the south. It was another orc female, riding a lathered, exhausted beast that was more tusked boar than horse. She was one of Grisha's, a scout sent out days ago. She slid from the saddle and knelt before Grisha, speaking in low, urgent tones. Elias stood nearby, feeding his sheep one last time. He could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was a report. Bad news. He caught one word repeated several times, a name spoken with a mix of reverence and hatred. Grak. Then the scout said something that made Grisha flinch as if struck. The scout gestured toward Elias, and she spoke a title. It was a long, formal-sounding word in the orcish tongue, but it was directed at Grisha. Blood Ash Ear. The world seemed to tilt under Elias's feet. Heir. Not just a chieftain, not just a warrior. Royalty. The woman he had pulled from the mud, the woman whose wound he had dressed, whose hands he had covered with his own worn gloves, was the heir to a throne. He felt a profound, cold sickness wash over him. It was the feeling of being a fool, a pawn. All their moments of quiet connection, the shared stew, the talk by the fire, the silent offering of the gloves, were cast in a new, harsh light. He wasn't a person to her. He was a tool, a convenience, a temporary shelter for a fugitive queen. His kindness hadn't been met with kindness. It had been used. He felt a chasm open between them, wider and more impassable than the divide between human and orc. He was a farmer, a nobody. She was a political exile playing for a kingdom. He had offered her a piece of his broken life, and she had let him, all while hiding the truth of who she was. The feeling of betrayal was a bitter acid in his throat. Grisha turned and saw the look on his face. She saw that he had heard, that he understood. Her expression was, for a moment, unguarded. He saw regret in her amber eyes, a plea for understanding, but it was too late. The walls he had carefully built around his heart for 20 years, the walls she had somehow started to breach, slammed shut with the force of a portcullis. "Elias," she started, taking a step toward him. A deep, booming horn blast from the western ridge cut her off. It was answered by another and another. The siege had begun. There was no more time for words. The world dissolved into chaos. Grak's warband came not as a wave, but as a flood. Dozens of them, a horde of howling, axe-wielding berserkers. They poured over the ridge and charged down toward the small farm. They had come not just to kill, but to annihilate. Elias's farm became a battlefield. Grisha and her 4 warriors, the scout had joined them, were a rock against which the first wave broke. They fought from the cover of the stone walls and the sturdy oak barn. They were hopelessly outnumbered, but they fought with the cold, desperate fury of the truly doomed. Elias was not a warrior. He had no sword, no skill in combat. But this was his home. They were trying to destroy his home. A primal, territorial rage he hadn't felt in decades surged through him. He grabbed the heavy wood-splitting axe from the stump where Grisha had stacked the wood. It was a tool, not a weapon, heavy and poorly balanced for a fight, but it was what he had. He didn't charge into the fray. That would be suicide. He stayed near the house, his back to the cold stone. When one of Grak's orcs broke from the main fight, trying to circle around to the undefended house with a torch in hand, Elias met him. The orc was huge, snarling, his eyes wild. He saw Elias as a minor obstacle, an old man to be swatted aside. He swung his club in a wide, careless arc. Elias, used to the weight and swing of an axe, simply ducked under it and brought his own blade up in a short, brutal chop aimed at the orc's knee. Bone crunched. The orc screamed and went down. Elias didn't hesitate. He brought the axe down again on the orc's head. It was clumsy, messy, horrifying, but it was done. He stood there, panting, his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest, the axe dripping in his hand. The battle raged, the air filled with the screams of the wounded and the clang of steel. He saw Urza go down, a spear in her broad chest. He saw Bolg fighting back to back with Karga, a whirlwind of death against impossible odds. Then the fire started. A volley of flaming arrows arced over the walls and thudded into the dry roof of the barn. The hay inside went up with a roar. Flames clawed at the sky, turning the dawn into a hellish orange. The smell of his burning life, of 20 years of quiet labour turning to ash, filled his lungs. He saw Grisha fighting near the burning barn. She was a figure from a legend, her blade a blur, her movements economical and deadly. But she was being overwhelmed. 3 of Grak's warriors were pressing her, forcing her back toward the flames. Her side was bleeding again, the fresh red soaking through the linen bandages. Something inside Elias broke. All the hurt, the betrayal, the fear, it burned away, leaving only one cold, clear thought. He would not let them have her. He ran from the relative safety of the house, screaming a wordless cry of fury, and slammed into the back of one of the orcs attacking Grisha. He drove the blade of his axe deep into the orc's spine. The creature stiffened and collapsed, pulling the axe from Elias's hands. Unarmed, Elias grabbed a pitchfork that had been leaning against the wall. He jabbed it forward, forcing another of the attackers to stumble back, his face a mask of shock at this mad old human. The momentary distraction was all Grisha needed. She dispatched the third orc and spun to face the one Elias had pushed back. But before she could strike, a new figure entered the fray. He was immense, even for an orc, clad in black iron armor and carrying a massive two-handed warhammer. Scars covered every inch of his exposed skin. This was Grak, the usurper. "Blood ash air," Grak boomed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Hiding behind a human farmer. How far you have fallen." He ignored Elias, dismissing him completely, and advanced on Grisha. The remaining warriors on both sides paused, watching their leaders. The duel began. It was not a spar, it was a brutal contest of strength and will. Grak's hammer was slow but devastating. Grisha's sword was a flash of light, seeking a weakness in his heavy armor. The barn was collapsing now, sending a shower of sparks and burning timbers into the yard. The heat was intense. Elias felt his skin blistering. Karga and Bolg were back to back, surrounded. It was the end. Grisha, weakened by her old wound and the long fight, stumbled. Grak saw his opening and swung his hammer in a vicious arc that caught her sword arm. There was a sickening crack. Her sword clattered to the ground. She staggered back, clutching her broken arm, her face pale with shock and pain. Grak laughed, a horrible, triumphant sound. He raised his hammer for the final, killing blow. It was in that moment, with death a breath away, that Grisha did the last thing anyone expected. She ignored Grak. She turned her head and looked directly at Elias. Her voice, clear and commanding, cut across the battlefield like iron breaking. "Elias!" He froze, the pitchfork held uselessly in his hands. "This man stood against you when my own clan would not," she shouted, her voice ringing with power despite her injuries. "This human, this farmer, has more honor in his calloused hands than you have in your entire bloodline, Grak." Grak hesitated, his hammer held aloft, confused by this bizarre turn. "I am Grisha, the blood ash heir," she declared, her voice resonating with ancient authority. "And I claim this man, Elias of the West Hills, for my own. He will stand beside me. He will have a place at my forge and a seat at my council. His life is my life. To harm him is to declare war not on a fugitive, but on the true heart of the Blood Ash clan." A stunned silence fell over the battlefield. Even Grak's warriors lowered their weapons, staring. This was more than a battlefield proclamation. It was a political act. A formal, binding declaration made before witnesses. She wasn't offering him protection. She was forging an alliance. She was elevating him, this human nobody, to a position of status within her clan's structure. She was defying every law of tradition and power. She was choosing him, publicly, in the face of certain death. The hurt and betrayal in Elias's heart vanished, burned away by the sheer, magnificent audacity of her declaration. He saw it now. It hadn't been a lie, it had been a desperation. And in this final moment, she wasn't hiding behind her title. She was using it as a shield for him. Grak stared, his face a contortion of fury and disbelief. "You are insane," he spat. "You would bind yourself to this thing." He gestured at Elias with his hammer. "You disgrace your ancestors." "My ancestors valued strength," Grisha retorted, her good hand clutching her broken arm. "They did not care what skin it wore." That was when Elias moved. He didn't think, he acted. While Grak was distracted, his focus entirely on the defiant, wounded woman before him, Elias charged. He wasn't aiming for the giant orc. He was aiming for Grisha's fallen sword. He scooped it up from the dirt. It was heavy, perfectly balanced, alive in his hand in a way his axe had never been. He didn't know how to use it, not properly, but he turned, put his back to Grisha's, and faced the stunned usurper. He held the blade in a clumsy, two-handed grip, planting his feet in the mud of his ruined farm. He was just a farmer, old, tired, and out of his depth. But he stood beside a queen. "Then stand," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Grak roared in fury at the insult, the sheer impertinence of it. He swung his hammer not at Grisha, but at Elias. The blow was meant to obliterate him. But Karga was there, the loyal, grim-faced warrior, seeing her leader's intent, had fought her way clear. She threw herself in front of Elias, her own axe raised. Grak's hammer met her axe with a cataclysmic crash that shattered both the weapon and the bones in Karga's arm. She was thrown back like a rag doll, but she had saved him. And in that split second, Grisha, with her one good arm, drew a long, wicked-looking dagger from her boot and plunged it deep into the unprotected joint at the back of Grak's knee. The giant bellowed in agony and his leg buckled. He fell to one knee, roaring, his hammer falling from his grasp. His warband, seeing their champion brought low, faltered. Bolg and the other surviving warrior pressed their advantage, cutting down two more of the confused attackers. The tide had turned, not with a great wave, but with a single, desperate act of defiance. Grak's warriors, their leader crippled and their morale broken, began to fall back, melting away into the woods from whence they came. Grak himself was dragged away by his lieutenants, screaming curses and threats of vengeance. The battle was over. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the burning barn and the groans of the dying. The farm was a ruin. The fields were trampled and blood-soaked. The barn was a skeleton of blackened timbers. His home, his sanctuary, was gone. Elias stood in the center of the wreckage, the borrowed sword hanging heavy in his hand. Grisha was being tended to by Bolg, her broken arm being splintered. Karga lay nearby, her face pale but her eyes fierce and alive. They had survived. Grisha met his gaze across the devastation. Her public declaration still hung in the air between them, a tangible thing. She had offered him a new life in the ashes of his old one. He walked over to her. He looked at the ruins of his past, then at her, the terrifying promise of a future. He felt a weariness so profound it was like a physical weight. But underneath it, there was something else, a flicker of purpose he hadn't felt since Martha died. "Your offer," he said, his voice rough with smoke and exhaustion. "It stands," she said, her voice soft but firm. a place by my side. He looked down at his hands, one still gripping her sword, the other covered in blisters and blood. He thought of her pride, her strength, her willingness to defy her entire world for an old farmer. He thought of himself, hiding from the world on this scrap of land, hiding from life. He made his choice. "I accept," he said. Then he looked her directly in the eye, his gaze unwavering. He would not be a pet. He would not be a project or a charity case. He had earned his place in this fight, not with a warrior's skill, but with a farmer's grit. But on one condition. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "Name it." "I don't stand behind you. I don't stand in your shadow, protected." He held up the sword, then offered it back to her, hilt first. "I stand with you, as Elias, a human, a farmer." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Or not at all. It was his own declaration, a claim of equal worth, if not equal status. He was offering her a partnership, not fealty. Grisha looked at him, and for the first time he saw her smile. A true, genuine smile that reached her amber eyes and transformed her harsh features into something beautiful. She reached out with her good hand and didn't take the sword. Instead, she laid her hand over his on the hilt. "Then we stand together, Elias of the West Hills," she said. They left that morning. There was nothing left for them there but ghosts and ashes. Their party was small and battered. Grisha, her arm in a sling, Karga grimacing with every step, the agile bold, and the southern scout. And Elias. He took nothing with him but the clothes on his back and the worn leather gloves she had given back to him, which he tucked carefully into his belt. The journey back to the Blood Ash Mountains was long and arduous. It was a time of healing, both of the body and of the spirit. Elias learned the language of the orcs, not in words at first, but in actions. He learned to read their silences, to understand the hierarchy in a shared glance. When they reached the hidden stronghold of Grisha's loyalists, he was met with suspicion and outright hostility. He was a human, an outsider, a weak link in their chain of strength. Orcs would sneer at him in passing. Warriors would challenge him, seeking to test the strange choice their heir had made. But Grisha's word was law. "He is mine," she would say, and the challenges would stop, for a time. But Elias knew he could not live on her authority alone. He had to earn his place. He did not try to be a warrior. He was a craftsman. He found the clan's forge, a smoky, chaotic place where armor was crudely beaten back into shape and weapons were sharpened with more force than skill. The clan's smith was an old, grizzled orc who had lost an eye in some long-forgotten battle. He regarded Elias with contempt. Elias didn't speak. He just watched. He saw how they wasted charcoal, how their bellows were inefficient, how they tempered steel too quickly, making it brittle. One day, he picked up a damaged breastplate that had been tossed aside as scrap. It was dented and cracked. The smith grunted that it was useless. Elias went to work. He used his knowledge of metal the patient, methodical skills of a man who mended tools meant to last a lifetime. He rebuilt the fire to create a steady, even heat. He used small, precise taps of the hammer, not brute force. He worked the metal, coaxing it, persuading it back into shape. He found a hairline fracture, and using a technique the orcs had never seen, he brazed it shut, reinforcing it until it was stronger than the original. He worked for 2 days, fueled by bowls of stew Bolg brought him. When he was finished, the breastplate was not just repaired, it was improved. It was stronger, lighter, and the curve was perfected to better deflect a blow. He set it down in front of the old smith. The one-eyed orc picked it up. He turned it over and over. He ran a thumb over the seamless repair. He stared at Elias with his one good eye, a look of dawning, grudging respect on his face. He said nothing, but the next day when Elias entered the forge, there was a hammer and a clear space at one of the anvils waiting for him. That was how he won them over. Not with words, but with work. His strength was not in the breaking of things, but in the mending of them. He became Elias the smith, Elias the builder. He redesigned their fortifications using his farmer's knowledge of leverage and foundations. He taught them how to properly cure wood, how to make tools that lasted. He was quiet, patient, and unshakably competent. He became not a weakness, but a new kind of strength they had never known they needed. Almost a year after the burning of his farm, Grisha, now the undisputed leader of the reunified Blood Ash clan, prepared for a parley with a neighbouring chieftain. She stood in her chambers, and Elias was with her. Her broken arm had healed, leaving a faint, silvery scar. She was donning her armour. Not the battered pieces she had worn as a fugitive, but a new suit of black iron plate, forged in the fires of her own stronghold. Elias had overseen its creation, and his own hands had put the finishing touches on it. He moved behind her to fasten the buckles on her backplate. His hands were sure and familiar with the task. It was an echo of that first act of care when he had tended her wound in his barn. But the tension was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet intimacy. There was no farmer and no queen, just Elias and Grisha. He finished the last buckle and rested his hands for a moment on her shoulders. He could feel the strength in her, the coiled power of the warrior, the heavy weight of leadership. She reached up and placed her hand over his. Her skin was cool, her grip strong. "They will not be easy to persuade," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Then we will be persuasive," he replied simply. She turned, her amber eyes meeting his. They were filled with a trust so complete it humbled him. In his quiet, forgotten corner of the world, he had thought his life was over. He had been resigned to being unseen, a ghost tending the ghosts of his past. But she had seen him. In his simple, practical kindness, she had seen a strength her world had forgotten how to value. And in seeing him, she had found the courage to redefine her own. "Ready?" he asked. Grisha nodded, her hand still holding his. Together, they walked out to face the world. The farmer and the queen, standing as one.